just want to make a quick commentary here. Um, I'm watching this show, Ugly Delicious. Excuse me. Excuse me. Um, I'm watching this show, Ugly Delicious, on Netflix. And it's not bad. It's a decent sort of culinary and culture sort of show, sort of in the vein of like an Anthony Bourdain or something. But I noticed something that bothered me about it. A subtle bit of sort of SJW bullshit. Anyways, so in the first episode is all about pizza, and talks about all types of pizza, and from the typical mainstream, the typical off the beaten path, artsy sort of pizza, whether the arguments whether some obscure Italian restaurants in New York that serve the thin crust New York style, or then they go to like Naples and taste the original Neapolitan pizza, and they also interview some people from Domino's, of all places. Very 90s sort of thing, sort of unpretentious, or mix of pretentious and unpretentious approach, which I think is consistent. It's probably something they're going to continue to do in the show, but that's what leads me to this interesting side thing. So in the original, pizza is an Italian-American dish. That's pretty much where it came from. So, and he interviews a few people who do the more unorthodox approaches to pizza making. Basically, he goes to one Japanese restaurant where they've made this sort of hybrid pizza, or various types of hybrid pizza. One of them was like they put sushi on it or something, which is actually funny because I tried that once and I didn't like it. I was experimenting like 5 years ago, but anyway. So they're Japanese people making an Italian-American dish and putting their own spin on it. And he had this whole conversation about what is authentic, and good food is good food regardless of authenticity doesn't matter. Which I would agree with that. Because I enjoy all types of food, and hybrids and things like that. So, I thought that was a good argument, saying that a Japanese person can probably make pizza as good as an Italian American. Maybe it's different, maybe it's better, or maybe it's worse. It doesn't really matter. But point of the matter is they can do it every bit as well as the original traditional makers. But then the ironic thing is that the next episode is all about tacos, which is pretty much it's a Mexican food. The origins supposedly are Mexican, and then he gets into the whole authenticity argument again, and saying this one Mexican dish, this obscure Mexican dish they had at a food truck in LA, reminds him of a Chinese dish or something, and they get into a conversation about back in Mexico, Chinese and Koreans and other ethnicities passed through and added their own touch to things. So it's possible that they might have taken influence from Koreans. So again, going back to the is authenticity real sort of conversation and things of that nature. But then towards the middle of the episode, it kind of turns hypocritical, kind of predictably SJW hypocritical, because much in the same way when they bring Domino's into the first episode about pizza, and they talk about how it's okay for Japanese people, for instance, to appropriate Italian American culture, put their own spin on it, and how that's perfectly fine. Well, then in the second episode about tacos, even 5-10 minutes even after they were having this conversation about could there be a connection between traditional Mexican cuisine, like Asians and what have you, like passing through and putting their own touch on it. Then it turns hypocritical because they start talking about Taco Bell, and unlike in the previous episode, the main Chinese guy was talking about like he's kind of a snob, but he's against pretension, and he doesn't feel like he should be ashamed to like something, you know, such as Domino's, even if it's really mainstream. So, but in the second episode, it's kind of hypocritical because they start trashing like Taco Bell and calling it garbage food and stuff like that, and calling it like, you know, like whites appropriating like Mexican culture, and like making fun of the guy who started Taco Bell, saying he's like this awful white person who appropriated like Mexican culture. And I'm just like, fucking, it's like you just fucking said like 5-10 minutes earlier that you know, culture is appropriated from each other like all around the world. And in the previous episode you were like, okay, like, yeah, it's totally fine if Japanese or other people want to appropriate Italian American culture, but it's like when if like a white person appropriates another culture, it's like suddenly it's just like this awful evil thing, and it just seems like incredibly hypocritical. And I wonder if even like they were like aware of it. And it's this typical kind of like blind like SJW like hypocrisy, you know, thinking that like white people are the most evil race in the world and that other races aren't capable of evil, you know, or just capable of I don't appropriation is neither good or evil. It's just something that happens naturally throughout cultures. And there was, you know, for thousands of years, like it was just a thing that happened. It was just assumed that it was going to happen, and no one gave two shits about it. And now, on, you know, in the last 5 years or so, now it's like, you know, white people aren't allowed to appropriate things from other cultures, even though like it's perfectly fine. They'll overlook it if like, you know, another culture is appropriating from a white culture, like Italians for instance, or Greeks or Germans or whatever. That's perfectly okay if a non-white culture wants to appropriate from a white culture. That's perfectly fine. But if someone from a white culture wants to appropriate something from a non-white culture, like that's not acceptable. And it's just so fucking stupid in my point of view. I mean, my point of view, you know, I remember in the 2000s, or even before that, but especially the 2000s, I've been like waxing nostalgic about that decade for a while, like the first 10 years. And it seemed like political correctness wasn't a thing. I mean, it wasn't like, obviously culture wasn't extremely far right, but it didn't really need to be, because like people didn't take that sort of shit seriously. So it didn't, because people on either the left or the right weren't taking things so seriously, and that's why we didn't get to the point where we are now, where because basically the left has become so far left and extremist that it basically pushed a lot of people to the opposite extreme, far right. So if you want to place blame about the far right and the neo-Nazis, you know, I don't think the far left really takes enough blame for that, because if they weren't so extreme in their positions, then it wouldn't have like pissed off so many people who eventually got radicalized, if you want to use that term, but not in the typical, you know, about Islam or whatever. But you know, but I consider like people going to the far right every bit the same extreme as like going, you know, oppressive Islamic or something. So, you know, extremes in general always have the tendency for terroristic elements. Although the whole terrorism thing is kind of a complex issue that I won't get into right now. But point being is that, yeah, I mean, I just remember like in the 2000s where like people didn't take shit as seriously, you could like make ironically sexist or racist or whatever jokes. I mean, I was actually watching the original. I mean, not the original, but well, yeah. I mean, both the original and the American version of The Office. There's a lot of politically incorrect humor in there, and that was as early as like 10, 15 years ago. And I look at that now, and like, even though the Michael Scott character is always making these sort of like usually unintentionally racist or sexist or whatever jokes, and he's corrected a lot of the time, not always, but I look at a show like that, and you wouldn't be able to get away with doing something like that these days. I mean, I guess they're bringing The Office back, but it's probably going to be extremely neutered, just like everything else. I mean, that isn't always the case. Actually, I was kind of surprised that like the Mr. Show reboot kind of took some politically incorrect moments with some jokes, but a lot of stuff that's being brought back is being neutered. It's being forced to be run for this political correct sort of filter. And I just look at a lot of stuff in the 2000s, and not just like a show like The Office, but like just bands in general. Like look at the whole sort of Afrobeat musical phenomenon in the 2000s. Like whether we're talking about like mainstream indie rock stuff like Vampire Weekend, or like stuff, you know, more extreme, more experimental stuff like Animal Collective. I feel like, you know, it was perfectly okay for white people to appropriate quote unquote from other cultures, because like that's how you got the whole like Afrobeat experimentation in the 2000s, and that most of that music appropriating African sounds into a recontextualized form. A lot of people doing it were white people. Like Animal Collective is all just, you know, white folks. They're all white. You know, and I look now and it's like, I'm honestly surprised that some kind of like SJW idiot hasn't written an article on BuzzFeed or something talking about how Animal Collective was like fucking cultural appropriation or something stupid. I don't know. It's just a lot of nonsense. Hey, what's up, guys? Just doing a little bit of a Andy Kaufman impersonation there. If you like that video, please won't you subscribe right here while my hands are doing this thing. Or also, you could check out another video or possibly a playlist up here. It's usually going to be some sort of alternative experimental conscious song, or it's going to be some sort of conscious comedy skit, or it's going to be a discussion. And right up here is pretty much the same thing. Okay, thank ya. Subscribe, bitches!